remember to buy a copy of your favorite books from the Cheeky Merchants. If we don't have it, we'll source it for you, but we'll definitely find the book for you.
Hello, Cheeky Natives. You are in for another exciting episode. I have the esteemed pleasure of taking you through tonight's guest. But before I do that, how are you doing, babes?
I'm doing well. I've been so excited about this particular book and this author. So I'm doing absolutely well. And I'm really excited about this podcast. I'm excited about all podcasts, but
yeah, you honestly have been excited for at least 10 business days. So I am super excited for you. And I don't want to keep everybody waiting. So I'm going to introduce our guest and then you'll understand exactly why our resident babes is so excited. I have the honor of introducing Arinze Ifeakandu, who is the author of God's Children Are Little Broken Things, which received the 2023 Dylan Thomas Prize, the Story Prize Spotlights Award, the 2022 Republic of Consciousness Prize, and was a finalist for the 2022 Lambda Literary Prize for Gay Fiction, the Kirkus Prize, the CLP Firecracker Award for Fiction. Woo! That is a whole bunch of prizes. Congratulations, Arinze. It's great to be with you. Arinze was born in Kano, Nigeria. He's a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. His work has appeared in A Public Space, One Story, The Kenyan Review, Guernica, Fictionable, Isele Magazine, and is forthcoming from the Gagosian Quarterly. His story, Happy is a Doing Word, is the winner of the 2023 O. Henry Prize for Short Fiction. And Arinze, who is the author of God's Children Are Little Broken Things, which we'll be discussing today, is our guest tonight. Congratulations and good evening and welcome, Arinze, to the Cheeky Natives.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
I just want to say, I loved this book for a number of reasons. But I suppose as I was reading your bio, one of the things that I was thinking about is you've been a finalist for the Lambda Prize, a finalist for the Kirkus Prize, and you also won the Dylan Thompson Prize and also the 2020 Republic of Consciousness Prize. How do you feel about your debut doing so well, right? And how do you feel about having won all these prizes, and how do you feel about prizes in general?
So I feel, of course, I feel very grateful. There's that I get to come out this way. It's a collection of stories, and especially a collection of stories coming from Africa. You go into it with all these anxieties about whether or not it's going to get into the right hands. But I guess the book just did its own thing with a notch of very wonderful believers. So yeah, I feel very good. I'm glad. I'm always happy to be shortlisted or to win prizes. It's its own kind of validation, but I also understand that prizes are not defining. A writer doesn't have prizes, doesn't mean that they're not but it's always good to be recognized for your work. It gives you press, there's money. I'm very practical like that, yes.
I love that you've spoken around that's the writing being set in Nigeria, and that's really important. And for me, for somebody who was reading the book, I felt it particularly that this was a text that was set in a very particular way, and you made very specific editorial decisions around how you set it. It's very clear that the book is set in Nigeria. You don't translate local language, right? You seem to have written deliberately from a Nigerian gaze, even in terms of geographical placements of where your characters are and what happens. And I think for somebody who was hoping to write for an international audience, but who also wasn't necessarily always located in Nigeria at the time of writing, that's a very deliberate decision. I'm curious about why this feels like a particularly Nigerian text and why that was important to you as a writer.
Yeah. So I told my writer friends that a lot of what we do, at least from my own perspective, at least in those years when I was writing these stories and getting them together, I felt like I was immersed in a general conversation about what it meant to write for an African audience, what it meant to write for an audience that is, I guess, to center your own gaze, because we had come into sort of the cusp of this sort of cultural reality where a lot of the careers were being made abroad. And then you see that like writers became successful back home if they were successful abroad. And so that sort of caused a lot of conversations, I guess, about authenticity or whatever that means. But there was a sense in which like my understanding, like and also participating in that conversation in those like years. This was like pre-Iowa years, many years back. So that should be like, yeah. So I went to Iowa around I think 2016, as late back as then. Like going through this conversation and participating in these conversations, I felt like I came to the conclusion that firstly, that yes, even though I want my work to be read by widely, I want my work to be translated widely, because I want to do it from a place of that centers my own, and because my stories have always done that for me, where I center my own enjoyment, I center like my own imagination, and it also like in many ways also like cater to what I feel like is the dream or the imagination of the people I care about. So sometimes I could just like having conversations like as a culture, and oh, these are some of the things that are like lacking us, or these are some of the places where interests lie. And they're like, it's also washes over you. It's a two-way street. But then like, where was my gaze at that moment? My gaze was back home. I think that sort of just propelled all the artistic choices that I made while the work was being created.
The stories in the collection merit a very subtle reading for the exploration of kind of the nuances and the dangers and the hazards of living as a queer person and a gay person, particularly in Nigeria, where homosexuality obviously is subjected to sanction. You could go to jail because of the Anti-Homosexuality Act and punishable by stoning in some instances, right? And I'm particularly curious about what some of the consideration was for you when you were writing the stories, but now after writing the stories, the book was up for publication and you would become to be known in Nigeria as the person who wrote God's Children Are Little Book and Things, which is a collection of short stories that are gay, right? And I wanted to know if there was any kind of consideration about what it meant for you to come out as this writer who was writing about the nuances and the hazards of being gay in Nigeria.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just unfortunate that way that literature chose me because instead of anything I do, I want to do it because I enjoy doing it, right? And I think in many ways, the stories I write, and I began writing these stories, not these stories for this particular collection, but stories centering gay and queer men, basically. I began writing these stories way back in high school. So you can see like my imagination had already, this was something I wanted to read. This was me who was having all these feelings, and I wanted to read books, I wanted to see movies where my desires, my fears, my worries, my fantasies, everything was played out. And I've always been doing it. So it's just like my relationship with the work. And I knew that there was no way for me to hide because unfortunately I have this relationship with this art form that requires, at least for me, utmost honesty. And I think that honesty is beautiful in itself because I have to be true to myself. And I find that a lot of times it's also this same art form that sort of, and it's not just like my relationship to my writing. Again, it's also my relationship to the writing of others, right? There are all these writers who you read, people like Achebe, you read Adichie. Again, because of like the cultural space from which I came. In secondary school, we read all these. We read also Michali, we read Peter Abrams, we read writers of like African American like, civil rights movement and stuff like that. And for me, there has always been to my writing this lens of engagement. And it's not engagement to say that I am trying to fight society, or because again, it's just the fact that I get to choose what I write about is that I pay fidelity to my own artistic and imaginative desires, my own, my own inclinations. Like that in itself is a product, I think, of that specific education. Yeah. Again, I'm just going to say, unfortunately,
It chose you.
the art form. Yeah.
I am interested in short stories as a form and a medium, but I'm particularly interested in why you have ordered the stories in the way that you did. My question is around the story selection. Why did you choose to order your stories in the way that it does? Because this book actually feels like listening to it feels like listening to an album, right? Because you take us through a very particular journey, and it feels like there is a story within the stories that you were writing. So why did you make the particular editorial decisions around the story order that you did? Why did you begin with the dreamer's litany and then close with the mother's love?
Honestly, I get this question a lot, and I'm just like, wow, that's wonderful, because that choice, I wrote the stories and then I wrote them once, and I arranged them as they came to me. And then when we were ready to go out to submit to publishers, my agent was like, "Do you have any thoughts about the ordering of the story?" And I was like, "No." And I think it's a testament to her sort of clear-sighted reading that she read through, and she was like, "Oh, I think it would be nice to order it this way." And I was like, "Yeah, I don't really care."
And we got an
I
album.
actually want to build, and we got an album, right? So I actually want to build a little bit on that. There's a common, before we get into the themes, because we will go into themes, but particularly just speaking around the order of the stories and the ways in which they follow a particular cadence. There is a way in which sadness appears in this book, right? I think I didn't count, but there's sadness that appears every in the book, either through the word sad or like a general feeling. But there was a distinction that she made, which was actually a very clever literary device to distinguish between repetition and a commonality of theme, or I suppose your stylistic endeavors. And I want to know how you went about doing that. So how did you make the distinction between what could be a commonality of the themes, or in a less talented writer's hands, what could have felt like repetition, right? That we're constantly reading about sad queer people, right? There's a way in which you avoided doing that, but also wrote to the tenderness and the vulnerability of the characters. And the Tlokonolo is laughing because I know they're going to say I'm being shady around the less talented writer. But this year I'm standing on business, so I said what I said.
I don't know. I actually had that anxiety. I think it's something that you have to have at the back of your mind when you work, because you also like, before you begin to even work with an editor, you also like self-editing, right? So I had that thought at the back of my mind. I kept saying, "Oh, remember, are you sure this story is not the same as this one? Or, or do these two stories?" Like, I guess I was always trying not to do something I had done before, and yet I was working with not limited, but a set of like ideas, which is queer men in a few cities, not even, let's say, Nsukka, Kano, like Sabongeri, Kano, sometimes Lagos, but mostly these two places. So like the setting and both the theme is already slim in a way, but I guess in imagining my characters as individuals and in coming into the stories, the issues that they have to deal with, their conflicts, kind of vary from story to story. I don't know. It's just like there's always that small man at the back of my mind with his hammer, being like, "Hey, let's make it different." And yeah, yeah.
I'm thinking of another kind of literary device that I think you use in the story, which is this emotive world building, right? You've spoken earlier about like your imaginations and wanting to put the imaginations, I suppose, on paper, right? But it feels there's this emotive world building and world creation as a literary device. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? The idea that like it feels in many ways like God's children are little broken things is a world on its own, right? And I think you used that literary device very deliberately. So you insulated it and you created this kind of emotive world building and you used it as like a literary device. And I'm interested in the creation of that world building.
I don't know. I think the emotional landscape of Ghost and Little Broken Things generally function, not entirely, but I think partly it's a function of how what I wanted, the kind of feelings I wanted to. You get what I mean? I wanted to inspire in people. Yeah, it's and so again, it also drives the artistic choices you make, right? So right now, I'm doing something just for fun, nothing serious, that I want to like enact dread. You get what I mean? And I find that I have to think about it's even syntax goes into the question of so it's not just about the incident which matter. It's also if symbols. Once you get into that mind frame of these are the set of feelings I want. You begin to at the back of your mind begin to make those choices. Put yourself in that head. And then like the symbols, the syntax, the incidents, they all come to you.
Yeah. Look, I think you did it brilliantly, right? I feel like reading these stories, the feelings you wanted to evoke or inspire or bring forth, right? For me, felt like I sat quite a bit with them. There's some stories where like I stopped and I had to sit in the feeling before I continued to the next one. And it felt like that was your intention, for you to not read this book in one sitting, but for you to be able to enjoy. And that's why I call it world building. You like created a world in which we immersed ourselves in. And that meant that we were not voyeurs, but we were also participants in kind of these stories.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I think feeling is a form of thinking, right, in its own way. And it's in sort of talking about, people talk about like, stories being so emotional and this and that. And the reality again, at least I think with this collection is that I wanted people to also think about things, right? And so again, like it goes like those choices are tied to that, right? But yeah, thank you.
We're taking a short break. We're taking a short break. So I want to speak about some of the themes because Arinze really put us through it all in some of these stories. Like Letokonolo is saying, we often had to just sit and grapple with the meaning of certain things. And I think with short stories, often there is no closed resolution. I think with novels, you'll read the book, you get to the end and you're like, or you're like, oh, I'm so unhappy, whatever the story may be. But the power of short stories is often that it lies in the reader's imagination, right? There is no neat and closed ending. So my question really is around, I'm interested in family as the first site of conflict, right? In estrangement. So we think a lot about conflict in romantic relationships, in relationships with friends, but family is often the first site of conflicts and estrangements, especially for queer people. So in the context of dishonesty and potential harm, like for example, in Where the Heart Sleeps, what is acceptance and what does resolution look like in that kind of about what the commentary was and when you were writing Where the Heart Sleeps? Because I feel that the resolution came from the character I least expected.
Oh yeah. So are you talking of like the word of the story entirely? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so what character did the resolution come from in your reading?
We're in class. What was your reading? Story.
No, I'm just like curious to know. But yeah, I don't know. There are several ways like that I could have approached that story. I could, but one thing with that story, I think it's also a function of like point of view, because it would be a different story if I had written from the point of view of, say, the wife. I don't know, but I think within society, especially within our homophobic society, again, because that story in many ways is about culture. What does it mean to like what about our culture? What does it mean to be a member of a family? What does it mean to love a brother? What does it mean to bury a loved one? And who has ownership, even of the way someone is mourned, the way grief happens. And so in writing that story, I was thinking of all these things at the back of my mind, but I guess this feels like a very class question, but it's just all those conflicts playing out, because this is it's a cultural stage. It's a stage of what's I don't know what redemption should look like in that state of reconciliation, I guess.
I'm going to come out and say I'm definitely going to use this story in my academic writing. I've been thinking a lot about what Sarah Hamed says in her book, The Cultural Politics of Feelings, right? And she speaks about queer feelings, and she speaks about this idea of the reason why queer people cannot be grieved is because our lives as queer folk is not admitted as lives. And so we are ungrievable losses. And I felt that I've been thinking a lot about this idea of what role does the law play in legitimizing the ways in which queer people grieve, particularly in a context where we are not married, right? So you think about the context of this particular story, where even if these people wanted to get married, they couldn't get married because it's not in the context in which they live in, it's not sanctioned by the law. And for me, one of the things that I was thinking about is just it felt like in many ways the story, like you're saying, was about how do we dictate, how can we begin to dictate how people mourn, right? The way the uncles are pretending and the way the aunts are going on, it's like stripping someone off their personal ability to mourn, right? Because they say, we don't agree with this. And because we don't agree with this, why are you crying? But it's interesting to think about the in which the story is told. It's like the daughter begins to look at it a bit differently, right? To begin to think about all these things about who legitimizes grief in a cultural context, right? Is there ownership to grief? And for me, I thought that was absolutely incredibly important to think about the idea of who owns grief, right? Who owns your grief, right? Because grief is so personal. And how do people say to you, you're not supposed to grieve the person who you love?
But also, additionally, that is the only story that has a woman's perspective. And Arinze then expands the narrative beyond just the wronged partner, right? Because Nonya could just be like, oh, my mother was harmed in a particular way. And so I'm speaking from this place of just having been the wronged partner. But there is a way in which, like you're saying, Nonya comes to know her father that she would not have known had it not been for this particular experience with his partner. And there's just something so interesting about, like you're saying, the relationship between grief, because there is an idea that we have of people and there's an idea that other people interact with them and the experience that they have. And in many ways, we want to own people because this is my father, but that's also his partner, right? And there's a way in which there's a navigation of grief that I think you're right is so interesting, especially with the perspective of money.
You guys just summed it up very beautifully. And honestly, I need this section of this conversation to just put on social media and let everybody back home listen. Because again, it's this thing, when we write stories, sometimes we go for the extreme choices, not always, but sometimes we do, just to amplify the theme, right? But these things happen in very subtle ways in real life. And you find people might say, oh, I'm not that person who's going to deny someone the right to grieve someone that they love. And yet, I'm not going to just not show up at my friend's wedding or because back home, for example, there are people who think, I don't persecute gay people. I don't wish them harm. I don't wish harm on them. And then there's this sort of unacknowledgement of one's life, so that even in living, someone doesn't feel real in that sense. Because again, your entire existence has been prescribed, like you guys so finely put. And then what that does is that you're having like all these experiences that are happening to you, all these things that are happening to you outside of the view. And I guess like a lot of living and loving is about witnessing, right? Of course, it doesn't mean that we have to, and it is not like someone should come and be opening your window and seeing all your private actions, but there are parts of ourselves that we want to be able to show to the people we love. We want to, and even I talk to a lot of queer men who say it doesn't matter. I don't care about what I do is not nobody's business. This I don't have to come out. And underneath that is deep denial, as far as I'm concerned, because it's an armor against a terrible thing that has been done, which is you've been made to live in the shadows. And it's a very violent thing to happen to somebody. And I think like in that story, and you guys just captured it so well. I was just like using a device to show a bit of that life.
What you also seem to do in the book, which I think is absolutely wonderful, is grief is a recurring theme, right? So here we're thinking about grief in actual loss, right? So someone passes away, it's the end of a life. But it seems there's also a lot of grief about innocence, right? In one instances, you've got this couple who were together when they were young, but they grow up and one of them decides to lead a heterosexual life and the other one kind of continues to have sex with different people but misses that innocence, right? And for me, it feels a very good social commentary on our lives as queer folk, right? That it feels like we're always in some way or the other grieving parts of ourselves, right? Innocence, smoothness. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? Just about the idea of and the weight of grief, but not in the context of death, but in the context of losing things that may be important to you, but also losing parts of yourself as you go through life.
And just to add to that, little bit before Arinze answers, is to also speak about the loss of relationships, right? So I think people think about the loss of relationships in terms of like romantic relationships, but there is a very real way in which queer people have to grieve the loss of familial relationships, of friends, in choosing to live a life that is true to who they are. And we don't openly speak about the grief of the loss of relationships.
Yeah, this is a very real thing. I don't know. There really isn't much word for it because I remember before I had always known that I would come out again because writing and once you publish a book about queer character, like with queer characters, you definitely have to, at least for me. And yet the depth of that communion, it's depending also on like the extent of their denial or of sort of their involvement in any kind of homophobic activities, right? But yeah, the depth of that communion is definitely affected negatively. And so there's this grief that one carries with and it's something that we just as with a lot of griefs that people carry with them over time, like you just plod on. And again, something that's very quite sad about it, I guess, is that the fact that we're expected to move on from all these things and without any kind of acknowledgement, any kind of conversations around it. And we're supposed to be understanding. And I guess that's like the reality of the world. That's also why we have these conversations amongst ourselves with people who understand. Yeah.
So I think a story that for me was particularly interesting was Good Intentions. And I feel like Good Intention almost gets ignored, right? I think there's a big focus on some of the other stories, but Good Intentions is interesting because there's a question around power dynamics, right? You are wrong, but you're also being violated. And that's an interesting space to be in for somebody who's a reader. The professor is outed, and that in itself is an act of violence. However, the professor is also dating somebody who's much younger, and there's a vulnerability and a power dynamic that exists in that setting. And I think that story was challenging to read because what is accountability in that setting? But also, there is a violence that is being meted out to the professor that is in many ways very queerphobic. And I don't know that this would have been or would have caused the hullabaloo that it did had it been a heterosexual pairing. And so I'm curious about this particular story because I feel like there was a commentary around accountability that you're asking of the reader, but there's also questions around the professor and his students. And I wanted us to talk a little bit about writing those kind of characters who are deeply flawed, but who also have violence acted upon them.
Yeah. So I reread like parts of that story recently, and I was like, what would this story look like if I wrote it today from the point of view of his boyfriend, as the younger guy, the student? I was like, that would be an interesting because it's one thing, at least in the time of writing that story, I think this, for me, again, it's about like the subject. For me, what was the subject? I wanted to, there are other things happening in the story, of course, a lot of things, but within every story, there's like a set of arguments or one big argument, right? And one of the arguments, or one point of the argument or whatever that was happening in that story was the fact of just like intolerance and what that can look like in sort of that kind of like campus space where there's a lot of violence against young people, basically bullying, a lot of lack of care. And I think if I were to write like right now, I don't know, it's the age difference didn't like so much bother me at the time of writing, as because I wanted it to be clear that this was a man that like genuinely cared about this boy. But then reading again now with a more mature perspective, because as we get older, we see things. I was like, this man also made certain choices in this story that I would like right now, hey, man, and what would it look like for me right now, writing from this point of view of that guy, to look at those choices. For example, when the guy tells the boyfriend, oh, you made me give up like going to volunteer and stuff like that. Basically wanting him to be more in the closet for his own sense of safety or whatever. But understanding it as just like a function of, yeah, that's what he had to do versus like what it's, I could also say, oh yeah, this is something of control, right? And so for me, it's just like choices like that would be worth interrogating if I were ever to look from a different perspective into the same set of like issues or the same characters. But the thing is just like the story is about what it is, or the story is what it is, and it is what it wanted to be at the time. But yeah, I totally feel you. there's a bit of a problem there, which to me, I wanted it to be clear that this person actually cares about this student, and that certain boundaries have not been crossed, which is the boundaries of, which I think is also part of the general project of the collection, which for me in many ways was I wanted characters that were sweet. They were flawed, they were like, there are a lot of characters dealing with a lot of ghosts and whatever, but I also wanted like an ample amount of sweetness to exist between them, especially when they are in love with each other. And so I didn't want that relationship to be, yeah.
I love that, an ample bit of sweetness, especially when they're in love. I want to speak about, I think, a really important theme that kind of emerges, but I think it's like just our lives as people. Hypervisibility and homophobia and queerphobia, right? So you think about the story, what the singers say about love, right? And you think about this idea of like compulsory heterosexuality in some instances, right? So this person understands in their lives that they are queer, right? But they make particular decisions about shedding particular parts of their identity because the world in which they're operating in, the entertainment industry, doesn't take really kindly to people being queer and rapping or singing or being a musician and all of that. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? The idea of having to shed parts of your identity in order to earn a living, right? The way that capitalism allows us to betray ourselves for one, our own safety, but also betray ourselves because we need to make money. And I feel like that kind of story was thinking about hypervisibility, but also queerphobia and what it means for people in the relationship, but also people outside, like him facing the world and making those decisions.
Yeah, I think being in, like for a lot of people, being in the closet is just always going to be a practical thing, which I think of again in writing that story. I was just thinking, okay, if a Nigerian musician were to come out, I wonder what the reaction would be. I don't know. I think there are a few musicians that will get away with it, and it might be even helpful to the entire cause. Yeah, I can imagine a few people who, if they were queer, they were to declare it, would inspire some shouting on social media, but then it would all die down, and then people would, I don't know. But yeah, like it's certain professions are more, in many ways, I am also lucky to be working in literature, which in many ways is far, it's not, there's still, we would like to pretend that we are evolved, but really, we're very racist. Not me, Sha, they are racist. But we have our own issues as well. But yeah, it's a very racist, it can be quite racist as an industry. Still, I feel like we have, when it comes to a lot of social issues, I feel quite lucky to be a writer because at least this part of myself, I don't feel the need to hide it in order to make bread, basically. But then there are like people who are like, let's say footballers and people who are even bankers, like a lot of professions in which people would like feel immense pressure. And so it would, for them to even breathe any word of who they are, they would have, it might come like at a cost that is quite immediate, right? And so for me, it's like trying to grapple with, and also because I love music, I love musicians. I thought it was going to be quite sexy to write something where someone was in love with the musician and the musician was in love with him as well. And again, with everything, social tensions, we have to come into the story. I think at the heart of that story was the love between Somto and Kayode. And then everything else bubbles around it. And then we feel like the tension we feel in later years when they have moved to Lagos and then things become different for them, especially with this profound theme. So sort of like just an escalation of all the things that were happening in Nsukka, which is just like these two people who live in a homophobic society. And now you find one of them who has now gotten into this industry where he has to be hyper visible. And the other character is not just any gay man, he's a feminine gay man. So he's not a gay man that you can hide away. So you look at him and just see him.
Before he does, right?
No, you can't. You look at him and you're just like, yeah, that's even to be right now. Just imagine if that were a novel. I feel like there is so much more I would just like love to do with something. Just because what are the tensions? What are the questions? What are the demands being made of him? People will be like, oh, nobody's asking you not to be gay, but just be less girly. And then you people are so evil. You're basically telling somebody to
stop being themselves, right?
Yeah, like what does that mean, right?
And I'm thinking of his mother, right? Because even his mother, who lives in Baltimore, just cannot rap her man. She's like, he's fine. Just tone it down a little bit. And it's a lot of what you're saying around tolerating people, because so much of that is tolerance. Like I can tolerate you having a particular kind of presentation of your queerness that doesn't make me uncomfortable. And I guess that's a good way for us to segue into what will be the last question. But it's around the tenderness and the vulnerability in these stories, right? And I think tenderness and vulnerability is almost seen as an antithesis to successful modern dating. There's a way in which people navigate relationships now that seems to be a little bit devoid of tenderness and vulnerability. And yet, so much of that permeates throughout the love stories in this book. And I wanted us to really just speak about why you felt that it was so important for your characters to love each other with tenderness and vulnerability, even in the face of difficulties, even in the face of impermanence, right?
And I think just to add on to that, I think what's also beautiful about the book and the collection is also humanizing people who have been dehumanized, right? So on the one hand, we have this almost palatable, really soft love in the face of homophobic society. So I feel that you do a lot of humanizing in instances where in the local context, these people have been dehumanized.
Yeah, thank you. I guess when I was in university, I read English, and one of my friends was like, I think if you were not a writer, you would be a critic of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. So when they say a critic of, for people who might be listening, who might not be used to the balance of literary criticism, doesn't mean I'm going to be an attacker of her, but it's basically my expertise, right? And I felt like it was a way of him saying, oh my God. But I think one thing that I loved about reading Adichie's novels was just like the ways in which those novels made me think of what I wanted in love. People will say, oh, it's just a book, it's just a book. But it's a book that's very realistic. These are books that are quite realistic, and you're seeing things like real care. And also because like in my own present life, at least from family and the people who I call my friends, I see it all the time. So it's not far-fetched. If you know what I mean. So it's, and I wanted that again, like in writing my collection. I wanted like again, it was back to the thing of audience. Who was I imagining? Anybody in this world could read this book and feel a lot of things for it and have a lot of thoughts about it. But I guess there is always someone out there who would read it and think, yeah, no matter what I'm going through, there is only the only kind of love that I will allow around me is a love that really that feels like not that is good. And I wanted that. So there's that on that one hand to be like, these are the feelings, these are the things that because books were able to make me. These are things that books were able to make me feel. I want my readers to feel the same. And again, on the other hand, there was like, I don't know, in my own imagination of what like love was or what love is. And it involves like for me, that's like a real sense of like investment, like emotional investment, where it's I want you to be well in all aspects of your life, emotionally, physically, and to be present in that way. Right? I don't know. It's just something that I felt really important to me. Because again, thinking about it, I'm like, how, and I think like this is actually it's like a common thought because I'm like, how are we oppressed by outsiders? And then when we are together, like it's an Olympics of oppression as again. It just feels it's very stupid. And it makes no sense. If you're not going to go fight that person who has oppressed you, if you feel you don't have the energy to fight the person that oppressed you, then just lick your wounds and go hug somebody nicely and do something nice for somebody who's part of you, who's part of your community. And I guess that's like just the thoughts around that book, which is just these characters have to love each other in ways that feel fulfilling to me.
Before we go, we want to give our listeners an introduction into this wonderful collection of short stories. And we won't ask you to read a short story that we like, but we'll make you choose from your 12 children who you think is the best child for you to read.
Are you mad? Oh my God. So which one? Do you want me to read it, or are you reading?
Yes, no, you can read just a small paragraph of any one of your children that you love.
I think I'm just going to do it randomly.
I'm curious to see who Arinze chooses because I sort of have the same.
Me too.
But let's see who's your favorite child, Arinze.
I don't have any favorite one. You just see me. I'll just do this randomly like this.
Mm.
Okay, let me see. Which of these stories am I in the mood for today? I think I'm just going to read from, and only because I hardly read from this one. But let me read from Mother's Love, which is the last story. Actually, I'm going to read from Alabama.
Okay.
That was my favorite. Don't get ideas. But actually, it's my video. Let's see. Okay, I'm just going to read from here. Obum was starting to feel better. His heart no longer raced, and his head no longer ballooned, making the world seem endlessly confounding. He was still worried that Ralu was angry with him, and that the moment they got home, he would grab his shoulders, pin him against the wall, and yell in his face. He reminded himself that it was Ibrahim's edible speaking. He had never seen Ralu raise his voice at anyone before, and then he worried that he was muttering his reassurances out loud, and that Ralu was hearing everything and silently judging him. They were closer to him now. The road had become bumpy, the streets darker, electric poles looming in the darkness, no street lights around. He tilted his head and gazed at Ralu, who, both hands maneuvering the steering wheel to turn at the corner, glanced at him and said, "You're awake." His face remained unchanged after all these years. Light skin, pink lips, eyes smoky and dull, like someone who was always high. That was the feature that Obum loves the most, those eyes. I think I'll stop here. Right?
Anyways, as you can tell from the Cheekinators, we absolutely loved your collection of short stories. We hope that you'll be back with some more, a novel. Perhaps you want to give us a cheeky insight. Sometimes the authors love us so much that they say, let me tell you what I'm working on. And so we get like a cheeky exclusive that you want to give us.
No, I'm still working on a novel, which already has been announced. So yeah, it's set partly in America, set partly in Nigeria. Yay!
Yay, we're excited.
Let's get it go.
Thank you so much. And again, from the Cheekinators, thank you for writing this God's Children Are Little Broken Things with such tenderness and such care. We felt it in our reading. And even this discussion was so illuminating because it just confirmed like a lot of the editorial decisions that we thought you made and just how much care you've really put into this collection. So thank you really very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's it from the Cheekinators. Thank you, everybody. Please do get a copy of God's Children Are Little Broken Things. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cheekinators. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast on all your streaming platforms.